The session had been running for 4 hours and 11 minutes when the vote closed, and I had been standing at the back of the gallery the entire time, not seated, not invited to the floor, not acknowledged even by the page clerk who had checked credentials at the door, and then looked through me the way you look through a window onto a view you have already decided is uninteresting. The Compact Council of Recognized Civilizations met in the Hall of First Remembrance on Vetharal Station, a chamber so old that the ceiling still bore the pressure seam rivets of the original construction, and every civilization of standing had its carved emblem inlaid in the floor tiles in the order of their admission. Earth's tile was near the door. It was smaller than the others. A junior member, admitted 14 years ago under a provisional charter that had never been upgraded to full standing, did not rate a prominent position on the floor of First Remembrance. I had been stepping around it for 3 days. The vote was 16-0. I had known it would be before the session opened. My counterpart from the Orvin delegation had been courteous enough, in the way that people are courteous when they are about to disappoint you, and want to be sure you understand the disappointment is not personal. He had told me, over a meal the previous evening, that the question of the Verksan resettlement had been considered thoroughly, that the Council's legal committee had reviewed the asylum provisions under 3 separate instruments, and that the consensus was firm. He had used the word firm 3 times in 40 minutes, which told me something about the consensus and something about his comfort with it. Verksan had been a protected civilization under Compact Charter. They had also been the civilization that held the Kethvor Passage rights, and when the Kareth Ascendancy had moved to dissolve those rights by force 14 months ago, the Compact had convened, deliberated, and ultimately determined that the Kethvor dispute fell within the Ascendancy's recognized sphere of sovereign jurisdiction. A difficult finding, the Orvin counterpart had said, nodding at his food. A painful one, but legally sound. What that finding had meant in practice was that the Verksan's home system was gone. Their 3 inhabited worlds were gone, the Ascendancy having made clear that continued habitation was incompatible with their administrative requirements, and approximately 230,000 Verksan, the survivors, the ones who had got to the Arks in time, were now drifting in the Velnareth deep margin, 3 generation arcs running on reserve power, their fuel stores at 9%, broadcasting a distress frequency that carried, in the Verksan religious tradition, the form of a prayer rather than a distress signal. The prayer was addressed to the Compact. The Compact had heard it. The Compact had voted. 16-0. No asylum, no resettlement authority, no fuel transfer, no recognition of displaced civilization status. The Verksan would be encouraged, the Council's language, not mine, to seek resolution through the Compact's good offices in their diplomatic capacity. Which meant, in the plainest terms I could translate, that 230,000 people were going to run out of fuel, and then out of air in a stretch of deep space that no one crossed regularly. And the Compact was going to feel regret about it at a later session. And the regret would be logged and archived, and the archive would sit on a server somewhere on Vetharal Station, and the server would outlast everyone in this chamber by several centuries. I watched the Compact's senior arbiter close the session with the formal declaration. His voice was measured and precise, the voice of a being who had spent many decades in this work, and who had learned to modulate the weight of what he was saying against the requirement that the saying of it remain orderly. He did not look at me when he declared the session closed. I had not expected him to. The chamber began to empty with the efficient, unhurried movement of people who had done what they came to do and were satisfied with it. And I stood against the back wall and watched them go. And I thought about the 3 arcs in the Velnareth margin, and the 9% fuel remaining in each of them, and the 17 days that represented. And about the fact that the beings walking past me on their way to their next meetings had access to the same numbers I did, and had found them insufficient to change the outcome of a 16-0 vote. I filed the intake application from my personal terminal before the chamber's doors opened. I did not ask for authorization. There is a provision in the EDF Diplomatic Corps protocols. It is not often cited because it is not often needed. That allows a serving envoy operating in the field to commit intake resources on behalf of the resettlement authority when a recognized displaced population event is in progress, and when a formal review process would take longer than the survival window of the population in question. The provision had been written after a previous incident, one that preceded my service, in which a slow, bureaucratic process had consumed the time available, and there had been nothing left to process by the time authorization arrived. The person who wrote it into the protocols had not been popular for doing so. It had required 3 separate arguments before a policy board before it was finally incorporated into the code, and even then it had been incorporated with a narrow set of conditions intended to prevent its casual use. The conditions were clear. The situation in the Vel Narath margin met all of them. The provision had sat in the code for 11 years without being used. I used it now. The intake application was routed automatically to the EDF Resettlement Coordination Office on Thresh Station, and simultaneously to the duty watch on the humanitarian tender EDS threshold, which was in station at Vel Narath Outer Approach, 3 days transit from the compact chamber. The application included the population count from the Verkson's last transmitted manifest, 228,911 souls, the discrepancy from the earlier estimate reflecting deaths in transit that the ARCs had logged, the fuel state of the 3 ARCs, and my assessment of the survival window. I put the survival window at 22 days. The ARCs had told me 17. I padded it slightly in the paperwork because I did not want the coordination office to read the true number and lose time in disbelief. I closed my terminal, collected my diplomatic satchel from the rack by the door, and left the hall of first remembrance. The page clerk did not look up. The Orving counterpart was speaking to a colleague on the far side of the chamber, and I did not interrupt him. I found the corridor and walked it to the transit hub and did not look back at Earth's tile near the door. I reached the threshold on the 3rd day of transit, having taken the fastest available courier shuttle from the compact station. The threshold was not, strictly speaking, a military vessel. The EDF maintained a class of ships officially designated diplomatic humanitarian tenders, which meant they were large enough to carry significant cargo and small enough not to require a fleet escort, and they were equipped for the kind of extended-range field work that a purely diplomatic mission would not need, but a combined diplomatic resettlement operation always did. She was 31 years in service, the threshold, and she had the quality of an older ship that has been well maintained. Everything worked, nothing gleamed, and the people who ran her knew her the way you know a thing you have lived with for a long time, which is to say they knew where she was patient and where she was not. The threshold's commanding officer was Commander Pietros Yale, a compact man of middle years who had been running humanitarian intake operations in the Vel Narath margin for 6 of the last 9 years, and who had, in all that time, never once seen an intake application filed under emergency provision. He met me at the docking collar with a look that I had learned to read over multiple deployments together. Not surprise, exactly. More the look of a person who has been given information that confirms a suspicion they had hoped was wrong. The coordination office forwarded the application, he said, falling into step beside me as we walked the main corridor. They also forwarded a note from the senior coordinator asking whether you had attempted to reach the council before filing. The council voted 16-0 before I filed, I said. That's what I told them, he said. They sent a second note asking whether you had considered a formal diplomatic protest. After a formal diplomatic protest, I said, what happens to 228,000 people in 17 days? He was quiet for a moment. The resupply convoy left Thresh Station this morning, he said. 4 transports, the hospital ship Adawa and the supply barge. 7 days to the arcs at their current position. Good. The coordination office is also sending a note to the compact diplomatic registry, he said, informing them that Earth has initiated an emergency intake procedure. They will appreciate the courtesy, I said. The compact will lodge a protest, he said. They will, I agreed. File it in the same folder as the vote. He glanced at me sideways. We had worked together long enough that he knew when I was not inviting further discussion on a point, and this was one of those times. He took me to the threshold small conference room, where the resettlement team was already assembled and waiting, and I gave them what they needed. The full manifest, the fuel states, the preliminary medical assessment that the ARCs had transmitted, and the cultural briefing that I had prepared on the 3-day transit from the compact station. They were 4 officers and 2 civilian specialists, the resettlement team, and they had the quality of people who understood that their work was the kind that could not be hurried without being damaged, and that therefore had to be begun immediately, and then done at the pace the work required. The 7 days to the arcs were administrative days mostly, the necessary business of converting a population number into a set of individual human-scale responses, which is the heart of this work and the part that looks from outside like paperwork, and which is, from inside, one of the most demanding things I know how to do. I spent the transit hours in the conference room with the team, and in the ship's small library, and at my own terminal in the cabin Yale had assigned me. I read what I could find about the Verkson during those 7 days. There was not much in the standard compact cultural archives. A junior member civilization did not always merit thorough documentation, but there was enough. The Verkson were a theocratic people, in the sense that their governance and their religious practice were not separate institutions, but a single institution, which had evolved over several thousand years of continuous civilization on their primary world before the ascendancy moved against them. Their skin ran to deep violet in the adult population, a quality that intensified with age so that their eldest elders were nearly indigo, and they were proportioned in the long-limbed, narrow-shouldered way of a people whose evolutionary history included a great deal of vertical landscape. Their eyes were large, adapted to the low-light conditions of a world that orbited a dim star, and they tended toward a particular stillness in company, not coldness, but the quality of attention that comes from a species that had learned to read small signals in low light, and had never entirely lost the habit even in fully lit spaces. Their religious practice centered on what their texts called the continuous address, which was the idea that all meaningful communication was ultimately addressed to something larger than the person speaking. Not a deity in the sense I was most familiar with, but something closer to the idea of the universe as an entity with the capacity, if not the obligation, to hear. When the Verkson sent a distress signal, they sent it in prayer form because, to them, there was no meaningful distinction between calling for help and addressing that call to everything that existed and could receive it. The signal I had read in the council chamber had been 61 days old by the time the vote closed. In the Verkson tradition, a prayer that had been broadcasting for 61 days was not an abandoned prayer. It was a sustained prayer. The distinction mattered to them in a way I was only beginning to understand, and I spent considerable time during those transit days sitting with the archive materials and trying to understand it, because if I was going to stand in front of the Verkson's senior elders and represent the entity that had answered their address, I wanted to understand what the address had meant to the people who were sending it. I also spent time with the communications officer, Warrant Second Class Amara Diallo, who was 26 years old and had been assigned to the threshold for 8 months, and who had, in those 8 months, acquired a working knowledge of Verkson formal address that the archive materials suggested should have taken several years. She was one of those people for whom language is not a skill so much as a sense. She understood the register and the weight of the Verkson formal address not because she had memorized its forms, but because she had, somehow, heard what the forms were doing. She taught the intake team the standard greeting and the prayer register, and she taught me the formal acknowledgement phrases I would need if I came face to face with the senior elders, and she was patient with my accent in a way that suggested she had worse to work with on a regular basis. We reached the arks on the evening of the seventh day by the threshold's internal clock. I was on the bridge when they appeared on the long-range display, 3 signatures in close formation. Their power output the thin, careful signature of a vessel drawing on reserve cells with the precision of a community that knew exactly how much margin it had, and had decided that wasting none of it was a form of practice in its own right. They were running dark on all non-essential systems, which meant that from the long-range scan they appeared as 3 dim objects against the pale background radiation of the margin, smaller than their actual mass suggested, compressed by conservation into something that gave no more away than it had to. Commander Yale stood beside me at the display. "They're in tight formation," he said. "They've been in that formation for 14 months, I said. "The arcs were built for convoy movement. They know how to do this part." 3 ships, he said. 228,000 people. Yes. He was quiet. The display updated as we drew closer. The lead arc was the largest of the 3, her hull carrying the marks of a long voyage, patch repairs, modified antenna arrays, the particular accumulation of modification and maintenance that accumulates on any vessel that has been doing a job longer than its original design intended. She was not, at first look, an impressive vessel. She was a vessel that had been kept alive by people who understood that she had to keep running, and who had made that necessity into a discipline. I found that more impressive than anything that could have been engineered into her original design. The communications officer had opened a contact channel on the Verxon prayer frequency 2 hours earlier, which was the correct protocol. You announced yourself on the frequency the population had been using, not a frequency you chose for your own convenience, because arriving on the wrong channel was a way of telling people that your convenience mattered more than their language. The response had come within minutes, and it had taken Diallo nearly 40 minutes to complete an initial exchange, because the Verxon response had been formatted as a sustained ceremonial acknowledgement, not a brief confirmation but a full formal reception, as though they were greeting a delegation at the door of a temple, proceeding through every established form of recognition and greeting before arriving at the practical matter of who was calling and what they intended. Diallo had been patient with this. Patient and attentive, in the way of someone who understood that the patience itself was part of the message she was sending. What she reported afterward was that the Verxon arcs had been aware of the compact vote. They had sources, she was not certain how, perhaps compact-adjacent member civilizations who had found a way to get word through, and they had known for approximately 4 days that the vote had gone against them. What they had not known, and what our arrival represented, was that anyone had answered afterward. The prayer had been addressed to everything. Earth was not the answer they had specified. Earth was, in fact, the answer they had not considered, and the formal ceremonial acknowledgement that Diallo had navigated her way through had, she told me, an undertone of careful verification, the Verxon repeating the confirmation of our identity in multiple different register forms. Not because they doubted the answer, but because, in 62 days of broadcasting and 14 months of attrition, they had calibrated their expectations toward a particular baseline and needed time to recalibrate. I stood at the viewport on the bridge and watched the threshold maneuver into approach position relative to the lead arc, and I thought about that for a moment, about the quality of being the answer that no one specified, the one that arrived on a channel that had been held open for 62 days on the assumption that something, somewhere, had the capacity to hear. The resupply convoy arrived 6 hours behind us. I saw them come in on the approach display. The 4 transports in formation, The hospital ship Adawa running her identification lights in the standard humanitarian pattern. The supply barge at the rear with her cargo holds full of the assessed needs profile that the resettlement team had compiled from the Ark's own manifest. The Adawa was the largest ship in the convoy by a considerable margin. She was a purpose-built humanitarian vessel, her design optimized for the intake of a displaced population, and she had a crew of 212 that included trauma surgeons, general physicians, pharmacists, mental health specialists, environmental physiologists, and the particular category of specialists that the EDF had trained specifically for post-displacement work, and that the rest of the humanitarian community had eventually started calling, without any irony at all, intake counselors. They were not therapists in the clinical sense. They were something closer to the people who stand at the door when a building has been evacuated and make sure every person who comes out knows that there is a door, that the door is open, and that someone on the other side of it knows their name. The Adawa's lead intake counselor had already reviewed the Verksan cultural profiles I had sent ahead. She had sent me a note on approach asking 2 questions: whether the Verksan would need a specific orientation of the intake bay. Some cultures had significant requirements around direction, light quality, or the position of exits, and whether any of the prayer language materials she had found in the compact cultural archive were accurate or whether she should rely on Dialog's more recent briefings. I had sent back that the archive materials were a reasonable starting point, and that Dialog's briefings should take precedence where they conflicted, and that on the bay orientation question, she should ask the ARCs directly, which she did, and the ARCs confirmed that the Verksan required that the primary entrance to any formal receiving space face what they called the approach side, the direction from which help had come. The Adawa's intake team had rotated the receiving configuration accordingly, a detail that took perhaps 20 minutes to arrange and cost nothing except the willingness to ask. The first transfer began 14 hours after our arrival. We used those 14 hours for pre-transfer coordination between the ARC's medical staff and the Adawa's physicians, exchanging patient files, establishing transfer protocols for the cases that would need immediate intervention upon arrival, working through the logistical details of moving people between ships across the particular distances and atmospheric differentials involved. The Verksan breathed a slightly different atmospheric mix than standard human-optimized internal atmosphere, and the Adawa's environmental team spent several of those hours modifying 2 of her intake sections to a compatible blend. This was not unusual work. It was the kind of work that determined whether the intake was safe and orderly or whether it became a crisis midway through, and the people doing it approached it with the steady, methodical care that I had come to associate with everyone on this operation. I was in the threshold secondary observation deck, which looked down over the docking approach corridor, when the first shuttle came in from the lead arc. Commander Yale had offered me the bridge, which had a wider view, but I preferred the secondary deck because it was closer to the corridor itself, and because I have found, over 11 years of this work, that the most important things happen at a scale that does not require a wide view. They happen at the scale of a single person coming through a door. The shuttle was a Verksan vessel, old, its hull bearing the patina of a craft that had been in service for longer than it was strictly designed to be. The ARCs were generation ships in the functional sense. They had been built for long-haul movement, and they had been carrying this population in varying states of distress for 14 months. Everything on them was older than it should have been, more worn, more carefully maintained by people who understood that the difference between a functional seal and a failed one was the difference between air and vacuum, and who had made the maintenance of that difference into a form of practice that was, given what I now understood about Verksan religious life, probably indistinguishable from the kind of prayer you perform with your hands and your attention rather than your voice. The shuttle docked, the airlock cycled. The first Verksan through the door was a child. This was not planned. The transfer protocols had prioritized medical cases. The ARCs had reported significant numbers of individuals requiring immediate care, and the Adawa's team had set up a triage system to identify them. But the ARCs had organized their own boarding in the way that made sense to them, which was to send the children first, and the children had come through the shuttle in a group of perhaps 30, escorted by several adults. Moving with the particular quality of motion of children who have been told to be calm, and who are trying very hard to be calm, and who are also aware that something very large is happening, and are not entirely sure what it means. The children were extraordinary. I say this without sentimentality. They were a species I had never seen in person, only in archive photographs, and the photographs had not conveyed the quality of their skin in light. The deep violet shifting at the edges of their faces in a way that seemed almost to shimmer as they moved, as though the color were not a fixed property but a response to something in the air around them. Their eyes were large and very dark, and they moved them quickly, taking in the corridor, the threshold standard-issue composite walls, the overhead lighting, the faces of the intake team waiting at the receiving station, and then settling, most of them, on the intake team's faces in a way that suggested they were looking for something specific. Not threat assessment. Something more like the thing you look for on a face when you want to know whether the door is truly open, or whether it has been opened only far enough to look through. The lead intake officer was Sergeant Teresa Okonkwo, who had been doing intake work for 11 years, and who had a quality of complete stillness that I had noticed on our first deployment together, and had come to understand was not detachment, but its opposite, a form of attention so complete that it read from outside as stillness. She crouched down when the first child reached her, which put her at eye level with a Verksan child of perhaps 7 years, and she said, in the Verksan formal greeting that Diallo had spent the transit days teaching the intake team, the phrase that translated roughly as, "You are seen, you are received, this is your door." The child looked at her for a moment, then reached out and touched Okonkwo's face with 2 fingers, a gesture I learned later was the Verksan way of confirming the presence of another being, a contact gesture reserved for moments when the evidence of the eyes alone was insufficient, because what the eyes were seeing was too unexpected to trust without the corroboration of touch. Okonkwo held very still. The child's hand dropped. The child moved on to the intake station. Behind the children, the adults were coming through. They came in the order the ARCs had organized them, which I later learned was the Verksan traditional order for any movement from one space to another. The young first, then the old, then the working-age adults, then the religious practitioners, then the ARC's own crew and governance officers last of all, in the tradition of captains and their ships. The elders came in the second wave, moving slowly, some of them assisted by younger attendants, their skin the deep indigo that age brought, some of them so old that the violet had gone almost black at the temples and hands, the color deepening the way certain woods deepen with time until they seemed to hold the light rather than reflect it. They moved through the corridor with the formal uprightness of people who carry their dignity as a practice, not a posture, and they looked at the walls and ceiling of the thresholds receiving bay with the same careful attention the children had shown, taking in the new space, the human geometry of it, the particular quality of light. The medical cases came in among the waves, flagged by the ARC's own medical staff who had done pre-transfer assessment using a standardized form the Adawa's team had sent over. The Adawa's physicians were waiting at a dedicated intake corridor to the starboard side, and they received the medical cases with the same steady, unhurried competence that I had come to associate with everyone on this convoy. There were no heroics. There was no visible drama. There was a man with an untreated respiratory condition being walked by his family toward a physician who had his file already open on a portable display, and who greeted him by the short form of his name. A small thing. Learning the short form, Diallo's team had spent 2 hours on the name register question alone, and the man stopped when he heard his name said correctly, and looked at the physician in the way that you look at a thing you had been told to stop expecting. The transfer ran for 31 hours. The full 31 hours were not constant high intensity. The intake team worked in shifts. The medical staff on the Adawa worked in shifts. Commander Yale slept for 6 hours in the middle of the operation and expected his officers to do the same in rotation, which they did. I slept for 4 hours, which was less than I should have, but the secondary observation deck was too close, and the work happening below it was too consequential for me to stay away from entirely. I watched in intervals, 4 or 5 times through the 31 hours, and what I observed was the steady, unremarkable machinery of people doing difficult work correctly. Intake officers directing the flow, medical teams assessing and routing, supply officers distributing the initial allocation packs that the resettlement team had prepared. Each pack tailored to the Verxon's assessed needs based on the manifest data, which had been updated 3 times since departure as the ARCs transmitted more precise information in preparation for the transfer. Among the items in the allocation packs were several that the resettlement team had included on my recommendation, following the cultural briefing. Small lighting units calibrated to the dim spectrum that Verxon eyes preferred, prayer language reference texts printed in a format the Verxon publishing conventions used, and a note in formal Verxon address that identified the threshold and the convoy by name and explained, in the ceremonial register of the continuous address, that these ships had heard the prayer and had come as the answer that the prayer had not specified. I had written that last part myself, working with Diallo over most of a transit day to get the register right. It was a small thing. It was also, I thought, the correct thing, because there are moments in this work where the practical and the ceremonial are not actually separate, where telling someone that their prayer was heard in the only language in which they have the vocabulary to receive that information is not a symbolic gesture, but a material one. The difference between a person knowing they have been received and a person not knowing, which is the difference between a person who can begin to rest and a person who cannot. The Verxon elders, when they came through, did something I had not been told to expect. They prostrated. I was on the secondary observation deck when the first group of senior elders came through the receiving corridor, and I saw it happen. There were 6 of them in the first group, their attendants a few steps behind, and when they reached the receiving station and the intake officer extended the formal greeting, the lead elder, a woman of very great age, her skin nearly black with it, her eyes carrying the large-pupilled quality of deep age in their species, stopped. She turned to face the intake officer directly, and then she went to her knees, and then she placed her forehead on the composite floor of the threshold's receiving corridor. Okonkwo went very still. The elder held the prostration for the count of perhaps 10 seconds. Then the other 5 elders did the same, following in descending order of age, each in turn, a formal sequence rather than a simultaneous movement. Okonkwo looked up at the ceiling for a moment, and I recognized the look of a person who is encountering something that is too large for the professional register to contain, and who is doing the work of not letting that show in a way that would interrupt the elder's gesture or diminish it. Then she crouched down and touched the floor near the elder's hand, not the elder's hand itself, which would have been presumptuous, but near it, close enough for the contact sense that the Verxon used for confirmation, and she said the phrase again, the one Diallo had taught her. "You are seen. You are received. This is your door." The elder raised her head and looked at Okonkwo from a distance of perhaps 30 centimeters. I could not see her face clearly from the observation deck, but I saw the movement of her hands, a gesture she brought up from below waist height and extended forward, the fingers spread in a way that looked deliberate and formal, a gesture I did not recognize from the archive materials. Diallo, who had been monitoring the intake floor audio, came to find me 20 minutes later and told me what the gesture was. It was the Verxon gesture of acknowledged debt, not a debt the elder was conferring on the intake officer, but a debt the elder was acknowledging having received. The distinction was important. In Verkson practice, a debt acknowledged was a debt held in trust by the person who acknowledged it, not owed to the person who had generated it. The elder was telling Okonkwo, in the full formal language of her tradition, "I know what has been given here, I will hold this knowledge, and I will not pretend the weight of it does not exist." Okonkwo had responded, Diallo told me, by holding the crouched position for a moment and then nodding. She did not know the full significance of what the elder had done. She had responded with the instinct of someone who knows that a formal gesture in a formal register deserves a formal response, and had given one in the only register she had, and it had been, Diallo said, approximately correct. In the Verkson reckoning, approximately correct was correct enough. The tradition understood that the people on the other side of the door were not always from the same tradition, and it had language for that, and the language was generous. I filed a note in the intake record about the gesture and its meaning. For the resettlement teams who would work with the Verkson after the convoy transfer was complete, the cultural documentation mattered. Every small thing documented was a small thing that the next person did not have to discover for themselves at a moment when there was no time to discover it. On the 18th hour of the transfer, I was called to the Thresholds Communications Suite for a direct channel request from the Compact Diplomatic Registry. The message was from the Deputy Registrar's office, which was one tier below the level at which I would have been surprised to receive a message, and one tier above the level I had been expecting. The content was what I had anticipated. The Compact wished to formally note that the unilateral intake action taken by the EDF Diplomatic Corps under emergency provision was irregular. The Compact wished to formally note that Earth's provisional charter did not include a standing invitation to initiate resettlement operations within the Vel-Nareth margin without consultation. The Compact wished to formally note that the question of the Verkson status remained an open matter under review. I composed a reply that acknowledged receipt of the formal notes, confirmed that the emergency provision under which the action had been taken was being applied in strict accordance with its written terms, and advised that the intake operation was proceeding and that Earth's Resettlement Authority would file the standard post-action documentation within the prescribed window. I did not address the open matter under review characterization. A matter that the Compact had voted on 16-0 and then described as open was a matter I was not going to help them find language for. I sent the reply and returned to the secondary observation deck. The supply barge had opened her forward cargo section, and the distribution operation was running through the arcs via shuttle relay. The resupply team coordinating with the ARC's own logistics officers to prioritize the fuel transfer that would give the ARCs enough operational reserve to maneuver under their own power until they could be formally integrated into the convoy's movement plan. This was the practical bridge between the intake operation and the transit operation. The ARCs were not simply offloading their population to the human ships, because the human ships did not have the capacity for 228,000 people all at once. The intake was organized in waves, the most urgent cases first, the healthy working-age adults last, with the ARCs themselves refueled and resupplied to remain functional as secondary transport for their own population during the transit to the resettlement assessment station at Vel-Nareth Inner Approach, which was another 11 days away, and which had been notified by the Coordination Office to prepare for a full displaced population assessment intake of unusual scale. The ARC's crew were extraordinary people, seen at close range. Their technical officers had been maintaining 3 generation ships on 9% fuel reserves for 14 months, which was the kind of operational achievement that required not just competence, but the specific quality of competence that knows how to prioritize when everything is equally critical and nothing is expendable, and that had found a way to make that calculus sustainable over a duration far longer than any calculus is designed to sustain. I met the lead technical officer of the primary ARC. His name and formal address was too long for the transfer documentation, and his crew called him a shortened form that Diallo rendered in transliteration as something close to Versh. When he came through the receiving corridor on the final transfer wave, the crew going last as their tradition required. He was not old in the way the elders were old, but he had the quality of a person who had been doing a specific, demanding thing for a very long time, and was now, for the first time in that long time, being asked to stop. He stopped at the receiving station and looked at Okonkwo, and then at the corridor beyond her, and then at the ceiling of the threshold's receiving bay, which was a standard composite ceiling with standard recessed lighting that had absolutely nothing remarkable about it, and which he appeared to be looking at as though it were the most significant ceiling he had ever seen. Then he looked back at Okonkwo and said something that Diallo, listening on the monitoring feed, took a moment to render. The translation was approximate, Diallo said later, but the closest she could manage in a language that did not have the precise register of the original was something like this. We held it together for 14 months because we believed the continuous address would be heard. We were not certain. We chose to act as though we were certain, because in our tradition the willingness to act as though a thing is true is part of what makes it true. We are certain now. Okonkwo gave him the formal greeting, and then, apparently deciding that the formal greeting was insufficient to the moment, extended her hand in the human gesture of a handshake, which Diallo had explained to the intake team was a gesture of equal recognition between parties, used by humans in situations where they want to convey that the person they are meeting stands as a peer and not as a supplicant. Versh looked at the extended hand for a moment. Then he took it and held it for a beat longer than the standard duration of a handshake, which Diallo told me later was the Verksan way of acknowledging that a gesture from another tradition had been received and was being honored on its own terms. I watched this from the secondary observation deck. The transfer closed on the 31st hour. The ARCs were refueled, their medical emergency cases transferred to the Adawa, approximately 60,000 of the most urgent intake cases now aboard the 4 transports with full resettlement team support, and the remaining population still on the ARCs, but with fuel, resupply, and convoy escort for the 11-day transit. Commander Yale filed the operational close-of transfer report with the concision I had come to expect from him. 228,911 souls received and accounted for, 0 losses during transfer, 11 medical cases requiring immediate intervention stabilized, convoy transit to Velnareth inner approach to begin at 0400. I filed my own report to the EDF Diplomatic Corps and to the Resettlement Authority. It was a longer document because the diplomatic context required documentation that an operational report did not, and I was thorough about it. I logged the council vote, my application of the emergency provision, the compact's formal protest, and my response. I logged the transfer operation in summary, with a note that the full operational record was attached and that the cultural documentation filed by Diallo should be treated as a standing reference for all subsequent resettlement work with this population. I logged the prostration of the elders and the translation of the acknowledged debt gesture. Then I wrote the recommendation section, which was the part of a post-action report that went not to the record-keeping archive, but to the policy office, and where an envoy was expected to say what the action implied and what should follow from it. I wrote that the Verksan were a people of significant cultural depth, whose contemplative and administrative traditions had allowed them to maintain community cohesion and technical function under conditions that would have destroyed less disciplined societies, and that the resettlement assessment should be conducted with full awareness that what was being assessed was not a traumatized and disorganized population, but a community that had survived intact and would need to be received as such, with its governance structures respected and its religious practice accommodated rather than managed. I wrote that the compact's response to this situation had demonstrated a limitation of the collective asylum framework that Earth's provisional charter status did not give me the standing to formally challenge, but that I was formally nodding as a matter of record for whoever would eventually have that standing. I wrote that the acknowledged debt gesture of the senior elder was the most significant diplomatic communication I had received in 11 years of field service, and that I was recording it not because Earth had any intention of collecting on whatever the elder had acknowledged, but because, in my professional judgment, it was the kind of thing that should be in the record, for the same reason that all significant communications should be in the record. Because the record is how a civilization knows what it has done and what it is. I submitted the report and closed my terminal. Commander Yale found me in the secondary observation deck an hour later. The observation deck was empty by then, the transfer corridor below dark. The intake team stood down and the corridor cleaned and reset for the transit. Through the deck's viewport I could see the lead arc in formation off the threshold's port side, her running lights on, her hull lit by the reflected light of the distant star at the edge of the Velnareth margin, a dim star, the kind that would have suited the Verxon's eyes, the kind that shed a pale, even illumination without sharp shadows, light that asked nothing of the eye except that it pay attention. Yale stood beside me and looked out at the arc. "The compact filed a second protest," he said. "This one goes to the EDF Commissioner's office." "They will file more," I said. "They have a process for this." "You're not concerned." "I am concerned about several things," I said. "I am not concerned about the protests." He was quiet for a moment. "The coordination office asked if you wanted to return to Vetharal Station for the follow-on diplomatic meetings. The compact apparently wants to convene a working group on the question of Earth's use of the emergency provision." I considered this. The compact wanting a framework was the compact wanting control over the provision, which was the compact wanting to ensure that a junior member with a small tile near the door could not file an intake application before the session ended without someone in a position to stop it. I understood the impulse. I also understood that any framework the compact established would be the kind of framework that made the provision slower and the survival windows shorter. And I knew from experience that the specific difference between 22 days on a form and 17 days on an arc was the difference between a coordination office that believed it had time to convene and a population that did not. "Tell the coordination office I am fully committed to follow-on dialogue with the compact on framework questions," I said, "and that I will be available at the conclusion of the Verxon resettlement assessment, which my current estimate places at approximately 45 days from now." Yale said nothing. We both knew that 45 days from now the intake would be complete, and the assessment documented, and the Verxon population established in provisional resettlement housing, and that the compact's urgency about the framework would have encountered the particular friction of a situation that had already been completed and documented and filed, and could not be uncompleted. "The Adawa's lead counselor sent a note," he said. "She wanted you to know that the senior elder, the oldest one, the one who performed the prostration first, asked to speak with you, when you have time." I turned away from the viewport. "Where is she?" "Room 7 in the transitional reception ward. The counselor says she's physically well. She's 94 years in Verxon terms, which the physiological team says is roughly equivalent to late 80s in hours, and she's in reasonable health given 14 months of reduced environmental conditions. Remarkably so," the counselor said. I took the shuttle to the Adawa the following morning. Room 7 in the transitional reception ward was a small room made larger by the porthole in its outer wall, which looked out onto the same pale illumination I had been watching from the observation deck. The elder was sitting up in the medical bed, with the particular uprightness of someone whose default posture was formal regardless of setting, and she was looking at the porthole when I came in. Diallo came with me, because I did not trust my own ability to navigate whatever register the elder was going to use, and because the moment felt like one that deserved the best translation it could get. When the elder turned and saw me, she performed a smaller version of the formal greeting that the elders had performed in the receiving corridor, not the full prostration, but a formal inclination of the head, and the position of the hands that Diallo told me afterward was the greeting for a peer in a context of acknowledged obligation. She spoke for perhaps 2 minutes, measured and unhurried. Diallo translated in intervals, holding the formal register as carefully as she could. The elder said that she had held the continuous address open for 62 days. She said that in her tradition, a sustained address of that length was reserved for communications of ultimate significance. The kind you sent when you were speaking to something that you were not certain could hear you, but that you were going to speak to anyway, because the alternative was silence, and silence was not a choice that the tradition permitted. She said that the continuous address had a quality she described as the address that is also a listening, which was the idea that the act of broadcasting a prayer is itself a form of receiving, because you cannot sustain an address to everything that exists without becoming, in some degree, attentive to everything that exists, and that attentiveness was its own form of answer even before any external answer came. She said that she had not expected an answer from Earth. She said this without embarrassment and without apology. She said the compact had been what they expected, and the ascendancy had been what they expected, and the silence of the other margin powers had been what they expected. Earth had not been in the calculus. Earth was a provisional member. Earth was the small tile near the door, and the small tile near the door does not move in the ordinary way of things until the larger tiles have finished deciding. She said that the girl who had been the first child through the receiving corridor, not one from her ark's population, a child from the second ark, had described the human woman who greeted her. She said the description of the greeting given in the Verxon formal address had not surprised her as much as what the child described next, which was that the woman had crouched down to be at the child's level. In Verxon practice, she explained, that was a gesture of deliberate deference in the direction of the smaller person, the kind of gesture an adult made toward a child to signal that the adult understood the asymmetry between them and was choosing to reduce it voluntarily, without being asked. She said that no emissary of any compact civilization had ever made that gesture to a Verxon child. She said she wanted me to know this, not because she was assigning it a diplomatic meaning or making a claim on it. She had acknowledged the debt in the formal register, and she would carry it in the formal register, which meant it was not a transactional debt but a recognized one, a debt of the kind that you hold because the truth of what occurred should be held by someone, but because she thought the person who had sent the ships should know what the ships had done at the level where it mattered. Not the fuel transfer level, though the fuel transfer had mattered. Not the medical level, though the medical care had mattered. The level where a child presses 2 fingers to a stranger's face, because what her eyes are seeing is too unexpected to trust without the corroboration of touch. She looked at me for a moment after Diallo finished. Then she said one more thing, shorter than the rest, and Diallo was quiet before translating. The translation was, the address was heard. I will not say by whom it was intended. I will say only that it was heard. I held that for a moment. I had thought, in the transit days reading the archive materials, about the continuous address, and the way the Verxon held the line between the act of sending and the act of receiving, the way their tradition insisted that addressing something fully enough was its own kind of communion regardless of what came back. I had understood it as a theological idea. I understood it differently now, sitting across from a woman of 94 years who had held a prayer open for 62 days, and was now sitting in a room on a human ship telling me that the prayer had been received, not by whatever she had originally addressed it to, but by something that had been listening anyway. I said in the formal register that Diallo had spent transit days teaching me, that I had heard the address, and that the door was open. The elder made the acknowledged debt gesture again. The full formal version, the fingers spread and extended, held for a count of 3. I left the Adawa and took the shuttle back to the threshold, and I sat in the secondary observation deck and looked at the lead arc against the pale light of the margin star. Commander Yale came in after a time and stood at the viewport without saying anything, which was exactly what I needed, and so that is what he did. At 0400, the convoy began its 11-day transit to Velnareth inner approach. I filed one final note that morning, a supplement to the post-action report, addressed to the policy office rather than the archive. I had written thousands of such notes over 11 years. Most of them were forgotten within a week of filing. I did not know whether this one would be different. I wrote it anyway, because the record is not maintained on the assumption that any individual entry will be remembered. It is maintained on the assumption that the accumulation of true things recorded faithfully is itself of value, regardless of whether any particular true thing is ever cited. I wrote that the Verkson had broadcast a prayer for 62 days into the silence of the Velnareth margin, and that Earth had answered it, and that the answer had consisted of 1 diplomatic tender, 4 transports, 1 hospital ship with a crew of 212, 1 supply barge, and the activation of an emergency provision that had sat unused in the protocol code for 11 years. I wrote that the compact would file further protests, and that a working group would be convened, and a framework would be proposed, and then negotiated, and then revised, and then adopted in some form, and that all of this would happen, and then the next situation would arrive in some other margin, and the question of how fast the answer came, and from where would be the same question it had always been. I wrote that I had no recommendation to make about the working group or the framework, because the recommendation was implicit in the record, and the record would speak for itself to anyone who chose to read it. I wrote at the end that the senior elder of the Verkson had given Earth an acknowledged debt in the full formal register of the continuous address, and that Earth was not going to collect it. I wrote that Earth was not going to collect it not because the debt was not real, but because collecting it was not the point. The point was that the address had been sent and it had been heard and the door had been opened, and that was the complete transaction. The debt sat in the record. It would stay there. That was sufficient, and sufficient was enough. The lead arc held formation off the threshold's port side as we made transit, her lights steady, her people inside finding their way in the new geography of a ship that was not their own, but that had opened its doors all the way when it came. The pale light of the margin star lit her hull in long, even planes. The convoy moved in ordered formation, 7 ships in the standard humanitarian spacing, their running lights the only points of brightness against the deep drift. It was enough.